At 42, I go by the name of Cyrus Mercer. 12 winters came and went while I kept my head down in the kitchen. You lack the proper temperament for leadership, Barnaby Cross said every time I asked to review the daily docket. He tapped his pen against the wooden counter and smiled. The heavy oak cabinet sat right behind him, locked tight against the dust and the truth. Orville Dunn paused near the prep table. He wiped grease from his apron with a slow and deliberate motion. "We just cooked the food," Orville muttered quietly, staring at the floorboards beneath his worn boots. I turned back to the range. Every receipt and log in this building carried a quiet weight that nobody else seemed to notice. The ink never lies about what happens behind closed doors. Months slipped past without a single word changing between us about the future of the kitchen. I watched the figures pile up steadily inside the leather-bound books. Time would reveal everything. Let me ask you to do something simple. Subscribe and stay right here with me so you can find out what was tucked away inside that oak cabinet. This is not one of those stories full of screaming and slammed doors. It is calmer than that and colder. A quiet reckoning built one small piece at a time. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, because I genuinely like to know. I woke before the sun reached the docks in Ilwaco. The kitchen floor was cold at 4 in the morning. I pulled my wool sweater tight. Sometimes the quiet morning silence in the back room felt much heavier than the heavy iron pans I scrubbed daily. A cook learns to look past the surface of things. The grease on the grill tells a story the menu ignores. Simple numbers never lie when checked twice. Every delivery receipt leaves a trail. Barnaby thought I only pushed paper in the shadows. He trusted the grand story printed on cards. I knew the actual weight of the flour sacks. I spent 12 long years tracking every single invoice that crossed the stainless steel counter before the morning shift began. The thick ledger book pages filled slowly. Each entry mapped the pulse of the room. People trusted the glossy front. I trusted the ink. Every single column of figures remained safely hidden away inside the dark wooden furniture standing right beside the pantry door. The rule was never posted on the wall. It lived in the way Barnaby walked through the dining room. In the Cross family lineage, what was built by a steady hand belonged by strict decree to the man who printed the menus. This was the unspoken truth of the place. Orville understood it well. He worked the cold station for decades. He wiped the stainless steel prep table with a gray rag while the morning tickets piled up beside the sink. The kitchen operated on a strict hierarchy of names and bloodlines. Barnaby inherited the building. He owned the certainty of everything. Changing the black ribbon on the old typewriter was treated like drafting a major royal decree for the entire restaurant kingdom. Every price adjustment carried heavy weight. I stood by the table. My knife was dull. The financial ledger sat securely locked inside a heavy metal drawer across the quiet hall from the busy cooking line. Nobody questioned who held the pen. That belief made things smooth. Management liked it. When Barnaby reduced my working hours during the painfully slow autumn season, nobody in the entire kitchen blinked an eye. They viewed it as the natural order of things. The docket arrived Monday. Barnaby handed them out. You took the official weekly schedule from his outstretched hand and walked away quietly without asking a single question. No questions were ever asked in the hallway. Generations managed kitchens here. Their word was law. The grease traps were thoroughly emptied before closing time to align perfectly with the unwritten code of the family enterprise. Every single chore matched the rule. I watched Barnaby check stock. His fingers moved. He genuinely liked to feel the volume of the delivery stock without actually opening the lids of the wooden crates. Ownership was a tactile experience for him. The system required parts. Orville chopped parsley. I always kept my private records securely hidden away in the old oak cabinet right beside the pantry door. We maintained the illusion of a simple working relationship. Nobody talked about margins. Figures belonged there. Crossing that invisible boundary line was always considered a very grave offense against the natural order of the business. The boundary line remained untouched. Orville Dunn wiped the cold prep table with a damp gray cloth. Morning light cut across the wooden floorboards. Barnaby Cross stood by the heavy oak cabinet near the pantry door, adjusting his stiff linen collar with slow and deliberate fingers. Orville paused his wiping motion and stared toward the front window, while the heavy ventilation fans hummed above us. Orville tossed the gray rag into the stainless steel sink. "We all know whose name is on the sign, Cyrus," he said quietly. Barnaby did not turn around from his ledgers. The older man kept his fountain pen pressed against the daily docket, while every single morning began in total silence. I held my knife against the sharpening stone on the counter. The metal hissed softly under the steady pressure of my thumb. Barnaby checked the columns of figures written on the top sheet, believing every single line fully justified his absolute position. Nobody dared to question the man holding the ink pen. Orville walked past the range with a box of peeled potatoes. His boots scraped softly against the tiles. He set the heavy crate down beside the old hand-stitched quilt, folded neatly over the wooden stool near the back exit. That quilt had belonged to Barnaby's mother before she passed away years ago. Orville wiped his palms on his apron before speaking again. "Things are tighter this season than people admit," Orville said while leaning against the flour bin. Barnaby glanced up from his paperwork with a narrow squint. The boss tapped his silver ring against the dark wood, absolutely despising any talk of financial strain inside his kitchen. He preferred the comforting fiction of endless growth. I moved my blade across a yellow onion on the board. The sharp smell rose into the cool air between us. Barnaby adjusted his thick glasses and turned another heavy page in the leather ledger lying open on the mahogany counter. He pointed a dry finger at a row of supply costs listed near the bottom. Orville looked away and stared at the floor tiles. "You need to watch the delivery receipts closer today," Barnaby said without looking at my face. His voice carried that familiar tone of absolute authority. I nodded slowly and placed the sliced onions into a stainless steel bowl while Orville reached for a fresh rag. The routine swallowed whatever tension lived in the room. Outside the alley window, a delivery truck shifted gears against the grade. The engine noise faded into the background hum of Ilwaco morning traffic. Barnaby closed his book with a sharp snap that echoed off the cold tile walls before walking toward the front. Orville watched him leave through the swinging door. "You keep your head down and nothing bad happens here," Orville muttered while picking up his knife. I wiped my workstation with a damp towel and checked the inventory sheets. Every entry mattered to the final balance of the week, even if Barnaby assumed the numbers served his grand design. He never looked beneath the surface of anything. The kitchen settled into a brief rhythm before the lunch rush finally arrived. Orville stood by the stove watching a large pot of water come to a rolling boil. I checked the order slips stacked neatly beside the iron receipt spike on the counter while the morning hours slipped. Time simply moved forward while we worked under their heavy supervision. The ledger remained shut tight inside the wooden furniture, standing quietly beside the pantry door. Its thick paper pages held the actual truth of every delivery. Nobody else in this building understood how easily a neat column of figures could conceal a mountain of dishonesty here. The ink never lied to anyone who bothered reading it. Ilwaco mornings always brought a steady damp chill off the distant harbor water. We embraced the silence as a shield against the looming friction. Orville picked up his steel knife again and resumed dicing the carrots with a slow rhythm matching my steady heartbeat. The day was only beginning. The prep station was cold before the sun reached the high windows. Orville stood by the stainless steel table, slicing potatoes with steady strokes. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I carried the morning delivery slips across the room. The morning delivery slips were neat and ordered in my hand. Barnaby stepped through the swinging door with his heavy coat buttoned to the chin. He held a freshly printed menu card between two fingers. The paper was crisp and bright white. It listed prices that bore no relation to the actual cost of flour or butter. Barnaby dropped the card onto the worn wooden counter. "That price point needs to go up 3% on the lunch specials," he said. I looked down at the margin calculations running through my head. The numbers did not support the increase in any logical way. Orville paused with his knife hovering over a starchy tuber. He wiped his hands on his canvas apron and shifted his weight away from the cold station. Barnaby walked over to the tall oak cabinet near the pantry door. He tapped the dark wood with the silver ring on his right hand. The sound was sharp and metallic in the quiet kitchen. "You spend too much time staring at delivery receipts, Cyrus," he said. His voice carried the flat weight of an absolute decree that brooked no argument. I kept my hands flat against the wooden surface of the prep table. The family law hung in the air between us without needing to be spoken aloud. Everyone understood the boundary lines very clearly. Barnaby adjusted his thick glasses and looked up at the high stock shelves. He pointed a long finger at the row of bottles holding the imported olive oil. "We are running a proper business here, not a charity house," he said. Orville looked down at his leather boots and stayed entirely silent. I thought about the bitter flavor of the cheap oil Barnaby insisted on buying to save money on the weekly bills. Cooking is about honesty at its core, because you taste what is actually there when the finished plate hits the dining table. Barnaby did not care about flavor profiles or proper technique. He cared about the ink on the printed page and the columns that made him feel secure in his inherited authority. The kitchen workers were meant to stay out of the ledgers completely. The heavy leather ledger sat closed on the small desk by the back wall. Barnaby walked over and laid his palm flat against the leather binding. "This book belongs to the front of the house, not the kitchen help," he said. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm against the worn cover. I felt the old humiliation settle deep into my shoulders like a heavy, wet coat. Orville picked up his chef knife again and resumed cutting potatoes with rhythmic thuds. Barnaby turned on his heavy heel and walked back toward his private office. The door swung shut behind him with a dull wooden click. I stood by the stainless steel table and stared at the empty space where he had stood for 12 long winters. The morning hours dragged on without another word spoken between us. The heat lamps buzzed overhead while the soup stock simmered on the rear burner. Orville went back to peeling onions near the deep sink. I picked up my dull paring knife and resumed the morning prep work. Nothing changed between sunrise and the arrival of the first lunch customers. The daily routine marched forward along the exact tracks Barnaby had laid down many years ago. I kept my eyes fixed on the cutting board and let the silence fill the room until the prep bell rang out. The heavy silence settled over the cold tiles like a physical weight. The morning shift began without a single mention of yesterday. Orville stood near the range and flipped a heavy metal pan. I kept my station completely clear of any loose paper or stray clutter. Nobody spoke about the new ledger rules that Barnaby had posted yesterday morning. I walked slowly across the cold linoleum floor toward the dark wooden furniture by the pantry door. This massive oak cabinet had always held spare napkins and old cleaning rags. Now I began placing my own small personal items inside its shadowed interior. A spare pencil went into the corner. A folded napkin joined it on the wooden shelf. Nobody paid any attention to my quiet movements around the kitchen. Orville stared down at his prep board while slicing yellow onions. Barnaby remained locked inside his private office behind the frosted glass. I pulled the heavy door of the cabinet shut with a soft click. The old wood swallowed the sound completely. This was the place where I started keeping things that mattered. Every shift felt a little colder now that the line had been drawn. Orville wiped his hands on a clean apron and looked toward the prep table. "We only cook the food here," he said quietly while shaking his head. I nodded and picked up my chef knife to begin the daily prep work. The kitchen air smelled of stale coffee and boiling stock. Barnaby stepped out of his office with a fresh stack of daily order forms in his hand. He placed the papers on the counter without looking at my face. I opened the oak cabinet again and slid my personal pocket notebook inside the dark recess. A small brass key turned silently in the heavy brass lock. Nobody asked what I was storing away behind those heavy wooden doors. The distance between us grew wider with every passing hour of the shift. Orville kept his back turned to my station while slicing potatoes for the evening rush. I did not try to cross the invisible line that Barnaby had drawn across the floor. Ilwaco mornings always brought damp fog against the small window by the wash sink. I stood entirely alone in my corner of the kitchen while the world moved on. Barnaby checked his silver wristwatch and walked back into his private office without speaking. The silence in the room stayed heavy long after the door clicked shut. I reached out and touched the smooth grain of the old oak cabinet once more. My spare pens and private notes rested safely within the deep shadows of the lower shelf. Nobody else knew what was hiding inside that dark wooden enclosure. The routine continued exactly as it had for all the previous winters we spent together here. Orville dropped another batch of potatoes into the stainless steel sink with a dull splash. I returned to my cutting board and sliced the carrots into uniform rounds with steady hands. Every movement felt measured and deliberate now that the unspoken boundary had been established between us. The heavy oak cabinet waited patiently against the wall for my next small deposit. I kept my head down and focused entirely on the food waiting on my prep table. Let me ask you before I go on, was there ever a person who looked right past you, who treated your patience as permission to take more than their share? Mine did, for years. If you recognize that feeling, I would be grateful if you left a comment about it. Knowing you are out there, listening and nodding along makes telling this a little easier. The time of year transformed beyond the ice-covered glass of the culinary room. Winter rain battered the glass over and over. Orville carried crates across the wet linoleum floor every single morning. He set each box down with a heavy thud. I sat at my wooden desk near the pantry door. A dark wooden cabinet stood right beside my chair, holding extra invoice slips and bent brackets. My hands moved across the paper with steady precision. The leather-bound ledger absorbed countless entries over the passing seasons. Every delivery truck brought crates of potatoes, onions, and beef carcasses. I recorded every single item by hand. Barnaby stepped out of his back office around 7 each morning. He checked the main docket board with a critical squint. The business grew older, just like the men who worked inside its walls. Barnaby adjusted his collar and looked over my shoulder. "We need more flour before the weekend rush hits," he said, pointing a thick finger at the top line. I nodded and wrote the request into the margin of my book. The pencil graphite left a faint silver smudge across my palm. It was an unspoken regimen that needed no external praise. Orville walked past my workspace carrying a bundle of celery stalks. His shoulders slumped further than they did during the earlier years. He dried his palms using a soiled rag fastened about his middle. "These knives dull faster than they used to," he muttered, tossing the dull blade onto the prep table. My eyes remained fixed on the list of numbers. I was adding together the daily tally, had to balance down to the last penny before the evening shift began. The kitchen operated on a rhythm dictated entirely by numbers rather than promises. Stacks of yellowed delivery slips filled the lower shelf of the oak cabinet. Each paper represented a transaction that nobody else bothered to verify. Barnaby trusted the glossy menus hanging by the front entrance more than the receipts sitting in my drawer. I turned another crisp page in the ledger. The paper accepted the dark ink without a single blur. The routine became second nature after so many long months of steady work. Every crate of produce told a silent story about what entered the back door. Rain drummed against the metal roof above the stove hoods. Orville scoured the metal prep surfaces so that they shone beneath the glaring ceiling lights. Barnaby retreated to his desk to count the morning register receipts. I reached for another fresh sheet of blue-lined paper to begin the afternoon log. The accumulated records filled drawer after drawer inside the dark wooden furniture. Nobody asked to see what I wrote during those quiet hours. They assumed my work was nothing more than simple arithmetic. Seasons shifted outside the frosted window panes of the kitchen. Winter rain battered the glass over and over. Orville carried crates across the wet linoleum floor every single morning. He set each box down with a heavy thud. I sat at my wooden desk near the pantry door. A dark wooden cabinet stood right beside my chair, holding extra invoice slips and bent brackets. My hands moved across the paper with steady precision. The leather-bound ledger absorbed countless entries over the passing seasons. Every delivery truck brought crates of potatoes, onions, and beef carcasses. I recorded every single item by hand. Barnaby stepped out of his back office around 7 each morning. He checked the main docket board with a critical squint. The business grew older, just like the men who worked inside its walls. Barnaby adjusted his collar and looked over my shoulder. "We need more flour before the weekend rush hits," he said, pointing a thick finger at the top line. I nodded and wrote the request into the margin of my book. The pencil graphite left a faint silver smudge across my palm. It was a private discipline that required no applause from anyone else. Orville walked past my workspace carrying a bundle of celery stalks. His shoulders slumped further than they did during the earlier years. He dried his palms using a soiled rag secured at his waist. "These knives dull faster than they used to," he muttered, tossing the dull blade onto the prep table. My eyes remained fixed on the list of numbers. I was adding up the daily tally, had to balance down to the last penny before the evening shift began. The kitchen operated on a rhythm dictated entirely by numbers rather than promises. Stacks of yellowed delivery slips filled the lower shelf of the oak cabinet. Each paper represented a transaction that nobody else bothered to verify. Barnaby trusted the glossy menus hanging by the front entrance more than the receipts sitting in my drawer. I turned another crisp page in the ledger. The paper accepted the dark ink without a single blur. The routine became second nature after so many long months of steady work. Every crate of produce told a silent story about what entered the back door. Rain drummed against the metal roof above the stove hoods. Orville scrubbed the stainless steel counters until they gleamed under the harsh overhead illumination. Barnaby retreated to his desk to count the morning register receipts. I reached for another fresh sheet of blue-lined paper to begin the afternoon log. The accumulated records filled drawer after drawer inside the dark wooden furniture. Nobody asked to see what I wrote during those quiet hours. They assumed my work was nothing more than simple arithmetic. The calendar pages drifted onto the floor like autumn leaves. Winter turned back into spring with monotonous regularity. Orville dragged another heavy wooden crate across the tiles. He dropped the box near the prep sink with a sharp thud. My writing instrument was submerged inside the compact porcelain ink container, the black fluid soaked into the coarse paper fibers without a sound. Barnaby strolled past my desk holding a cup of steaming coffee. "We need those supply counts by noon today," he said, gesturing toward the back door. I nodded slowly and pressed the nib against the next empty line. Years left their marks on the wooden furniture. The edges of the desk grew smooth under my constant touch. Orville wiped his palms on a fresh apron every morning at dawn. His hair turned completely gray around the temples. He never asked about the figures filling my books. Barnaby spent less time inspecting the cold station now. He preferred his office chair and the company of his ledger. I opened the oak cabinet to file another bundle of canceled checks. The wooden shelf groaned slightly under the massive weight of accumulated paper. More receipts joined the growing stacks inside the dark interior. A thick rubber band held each monthly bundle together tightly. I tucked a stray invoice safely into the deep back corner. The metal hinge clicked shut with a muffled metallic sound. Barnaby poked his head out of the office doorway to check the wall clock. "Make sure the fish deliveries match the invoices," he said, walking back toward his desk. I pulled the heavy leather book closer to my chest. The columns of figures stretched across years of silent labor. The morning paper landed on the stainless steel prep table with a dull slap. Barnaby reached for the sports section before checking the delivery manifests. His hands moved slower than they did a decade ago. He dropped the damp newsprint onto the flour bin. A small tremor passed through his right thumb. He rubbed his knuckles against his wool vest. The gesture lacked the usual sharp authority he projected toward the staff. For a brief second, he looked less like a tyrant and more like an old man fighting the damp cold. His reading spectacles rested askew upon his face. He did not straighten them right away. He just stared past the window at the gray Ilwaco drizzle. I watched him from the corner near the oak cabinet. The silence between us felt heavier lately. Orville was busy scrubbing the deep fryer in the back room. The grease trap needed clearing out before the lunch service started. Barnaby sighed and pulled a small tin of peppermint drops from his pocket. He dropped one into his mouth with a dry click. He offered the tin toward my desk without looking up. I shook my head in quiet refusal. He tucked the tin back into his cardigan pocket with a slow shrug. The ledger lay open before me with its columns of actual expenses. $450 sat recorded as a discrepancy from the Tuesday fish delivery. The numbers on the page refused to match the glossy menu boards hanging in the dining room. Every week the gap widened by a fraction more. The structure was straining against the sheer volume of uncorrected errors. Barnaby cleared his throat and walked over to the dry storage shelves. He checked the flour sacks for moisture damage. His shoulders curved inward as he bent down to inspect the bottom row. He looked genuinely tired for the first time since I started working here. I almost felt a flicker of sympathy for his stubborn pride. He stood back up and winced slightly from an old back stiffness. He muttered something about the weather turning sour before the weekend arrived. I kept my pen poised above the dark leather ledger page. The ink bottle rested close to my elbow beside the pile of billing statements. Everyone knew whose name hung on the gilded sign outside the front door. That was the eternal justification for every inflated price and cheap substitute. Barnaby walked back toward his tiny office near the pantry entrance. He stopped by the coat rack to adjust his woolen scarf. He fumbled with the knot twice before getting it right. It was a clumsy, thoroughly human moment that stripped away the myth of his absolute control. He caught me watching him and gave a curt nod. I nodded back without breaking the steady rhythm of my work. The ledger pages turned with a crisp rasp in the quiet kitchen. Orville emerged from the back room carrying a wire basket of cleaned potatoes. He wiped his palms on his stained apron and avoided eye contact. The tension in the room remained thick enough to measure with a ruler. We all sensed the foundation settling unevenly beneath our feet. Barnaby closed his office door with a soft click instead of a loud slam. That quiet departure spoke volumes about the shifting balance of power in the building. I turned back to the columns of figures, waiting for my final tally. The truth had a quiet way of accumulating one receipt at a time. One more question before it all tips over. When someone has spent years telling you that you do not matter, what does it take for the truth to finally speak louder than they can? Tell me what you think in the comments. And stay with me, because the answer is closer than they ever imagined, and it had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. The afternoon mail brought a heavy cream envelope to the back counter. Barnaby dropped it right across my leather ledger. It was a formal letter typed on expensive, heavy bond paper. He wanted everything signed over by Friday morning. His signature sat right at the bottom in thick black ink. "This is my final demand for total compliance," he said, leaning over my shoulder with a scowl. I did not blink at the paper. The written words laid out his entire scheme in plain black ink. Every unauthorized transfer was spelled out clearly in his own hand. "We all know whose name is on the sign, Cyrus," he said, pointing a heavy finger at the bold header. I stared at the signature at the base of the sheet. He had signed away all his plausible deniability in one stroke. The formal letter accused me of hiding $450 in petty discrepancies. It was a total fabrication designed to scare me off, but the paper itself became his undoing. My records sat right beside my elbow in the dark wooden cabinet. They held the exact dates and matching receipts for every single transaction. Orville walked past my workspace while wiping his hands on a gray rag. "Let me see that paper," Orville muttered, stopping near the edge of the desk. I slid the formal letter across the wood toward him. His eyes scanned the typed paragraphs with slow-growing disbelief. "This goes entirely too far," Orville said, dropping the page back onto my blotter. He shook his head and walked back to the cold station. Barnaby stood by the doorway with his arms crossed over his woolen vest. "You will sign this paper before the evening shift starts," he said, raising his voice slightly. I looked down at the incriminating paragraphs again. The ink was permanent and fully attributable to his personal typewriter. No amount of shouting could erase what he had committed to paper. I picked up my wooden pencil and tapped it against the margin. Silence settled over the kitchen while the stove burners hissed softly. The record book remained open to the current month, with every column balanced. His written overreach gave my ledger the final piece of undeniable proof. I placed the formal letter inside the oak cabinet next to the older delivery receipts. It rested right on top of the stack where nobody else would look. Barnaby tapped his foot against the linoleum floor while waiting for my answer. I looked up and met his gaze without a single trace of fear. The kitchen operated on cold facts rather than empty threats from angry men. Every delivery invoice from the past 12 years supported my side of the desk. He turned around and marched back to his private office without another word. A massive wooden portal latched at his back with a crisp, definitive snap. Orville kept his head down and scrubbed the prep table until it gleamed. I turned another crisp page in my book and dipped my nib. The afternoon sun cut through the frosted glass and warmed the ink on the page. The church hall smelled of floor wax and old hymnals. Afternoon light cut through tall windows. Dust motes drifted in the quiet space. I placed my leather-bound ledger on the folding table. Barnaby stood near the front doors. He wore his heavy wool coat. Orville sat on a wooden bench nearby. He held a folded textile across his knees. It was the old hand-stitched quilt from the back room. Orville looked up as I unbuckled my canvas case. I set the stacks of tied delivery receipts beside the ink pad. Every column matched the actual crates that crossed our loading dock over the years. Barnaby walked slowly toward the center aisle with his heavy stride and stopped 5 paces from my table. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut behind him against the cold coastal draft. "You brought a lot of paper for a simple meeting," Barnaby remarked. I did not blink. "The records span 12 years of deliveries," I replied. His gaze lowered toward the black hide, binding the numbers tell the true story of the kitchen. "You taste what is actually there," I said quietly. Orville shifted his weight on the wooden bench. The old quilt slipped a few inches down his thigh. Orville reached out a calloused hand to steady the folded fabric before it touched the dusty floorboards of the hall. His gaze remained glued to the wooden planks as the harsh seasonal gale shook the colorful windows far above us. The total discrepancy of $450 from last month remained clearly marked in red ink on the top line. The handwritten letter bearing his signature lay right beneath it. Barnaby stared at the exposed papers with narrowed eyes. "This proves nothing about the daily operation of the restaurant," Barnaby muttered. I turned the page to the audited totals from last autumn. Orville stood up from the bench. He walked closer to the table with slow steps. He placed the hand-stitched quilt across the corner of the folding table. It was his small act of quiet defiance against decades of harsh kitchen commands that nobody else dared question in public. I opened the second leather folder on the wood. More invoices filled the pocket. Every single supplier's signature was verified by my own ink. Barnaby reached inside his winter coat. His fingers brushed against a small notebook tucked near his chest. He hesitated for a long second in the dim light. I watched the tension rise slowly in his stiff shoulders, while the grandfather clock ticked against the far wall. The final tally waited for his inspection under the brass lamp on the corner. Orville nodded once from the bench, and stepped back into the shadows of the nave. The church hall smelled of floor wax and old hymnals. Afternoon light cut through tall windows. Dust motes drifted in the quiet space. I placed my leather-bound ledger on the folding table. Barnaby stood near the front doors. He wore his heavy wool coat. Orville sat on a wooden bench nearby. He held a folded textile across his knees. It was the old hand-stitched quilt from the back room. Orville looked up as I unbuckled my canvas case. I set the stacks of tied delivery receipts beside the ink pad. Every column matched the actual crates that crossed our loading dock over the years. Barnaby walked slowly toward the center aisle with his heavy stride and stopped 5 paces from my table. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut behind him against the cold coastal draft. "You brought a lot of paper for a simple meeting," Barnaby remarked. I did not blink. "The records span 12 years of deliveries," I replied. He looked down at the dark leather cover. "The numbers tell the true story of the kitchen." "You taste what is actually there," I said quietly. Orville shifted his weight on the wooden bench. The old quilt slipped a few inches down his thigh. Orville reached out a calloused hand to steady the folded fabric before it touched the dusty floorboards of the hall. He kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards while the bitter winter wind rattled the stained glass panes high above our heads. The total discrepancy of $450 from last month remained clearly marked in red ink on the top line. The handwritten letter bearing his signature lay right beneath it. Barnaby stared at the exposed papers with narrowed eyes. "This proves nothing about the daily operation of the restaurant," Barnaby muttered. I turned the page to the audited totals from last autumn. Orville stood up from the bench. He walked closer to the table with slow steps. He placed the hand-stitched quilt across the corner of the folding table. It was his small act of quiet defiance against decades of harsh kitchen commands that nobody else dared question in public. I opened the second leather folder on the wood. More invoices filled the pocket. Every single supplier's signature was verified by my own ink. Barnaby reached inside his winter coat. His fingers brushed against a small notebook tucked near his chest. He hesitated for a long second in the dim light. I watched the tension rise slowly in his stiff shoulders, while the grandfather clock ticked against the far wall. The final tally waited for his inspection under the brass lamp on the corner. Orville nodded once from the bench and stepped back into the shadows of the nave. The old man swallowed hard. He looked away from the open ledger. He knew the columns of figures were impossible to refute right now before our very eyes in this holy place. "What do you want from me, Cyrus?" Barnaby asked. "Nothing that belongs to you," I replied softly. Orville stood quietly by the stone pillar. He watched the older man fold his tired hands against his heavy wool coat. The church was very cold. Dust danced in the tall windows. I slowly closed the thick leather binder that held 12 years of accurate kitchen accounts on the wooden folding table surface. "You should take your coat," Orville told him. Barnaby turned toward the heavy doors. He did not say another word. He pushed the oak panels open and walked into the gray afternoon light. The heavy wood swung shut behind him. Silence returned to the aisle. We stayed by the table. The papers rested under the lamp. Orville touched the corner of the stitched quilt with a very gentle finger before stepping slowly back into the shadows. "It is over," Orville whispered. "Yes," I said. "It is finally done." The church hall was quiet after Orville left. Barnaby sat on the wooden bench near the altar. The heavy leather ledger rested on my knees. I had the power to strip every last asset from the man. I could have forced the courts to take the building, the sign, the very plates off the shelves. I could have triggered an immediate tax audit that would have seized his bank accounts within hours. Every single discrepancy from the past 12 years was right there in my canvas bag. I held total leverage over the man who had demoted me and mocked my work. I did not use it. There was no satisfaction left in seeing him broken. I chose walking away instead. Revenge requires a constant fire to keep it burning. I had grown tired of carrying fuel. The numbers in my bag proved every theft, every rigged margin over the last 12 years. Handing those files to the prosecutor would have locked Barnaby away or left him bankrupt. That path held no flavor for me. The documentation was condemning enough on its own, rendering my testimony unnecessary to ruin him. I knew the taste of bitterness. It tasted like cold grease on an iron skillet. True cooks know when a dish has been oversalted beyond repair. Throwing it out is better than trying to fix a ruined sauce with more vinegar. Barnaby looked up from his folded hands. His gray cardigan hung loosely on his thin shoulders. He expected a final blow to land. He waited for the sentence to drop like a cleaver. Silence filled the empty aisles between the pews. I closed the leather cover instead. The metallic fastener fastened securely, accompanied by a crisp pop. I slid the papers back into my canvas bag. I looked at the man who had traded honesty for a cheaper grade of beef. He looked smaller under the high vaulted ceiling than he ever did behind his stainless steel counter. "You can keep the restaurant," I said to him quietly. He blinked in the dim light of the nave. Confusion crossed his wrinkled face. He had braced for a total collapse. He could not understand why I declined to finish the demolition. People who only understand power assume restraint must be a trap. It was not a trap. It was simply the end of my shift. I had no desire to inherit his failing enterprise or spend my remaining years running a kitchen built on false invoices. He would have to live with his own accounting. I left the ledger on the oak table by the door. The 12 years of accounting belonged to the past. Keeping them would mean managing his failures forever. I refused to spend another morning auditing a ghost. I stepped outside into the chilly Ilwaco breeze. My boots crunched on the gravel path. The morning sun cleared the distant ridge and warmed my face. I left the keys inside my locker back at the shop, but I did not look back once as I crossed the street. My time behind those metal counters was finally finished. The shop reopened under new management on a quiet Tuesday morning. The counter was spotless. I sat at my wooden desk near the pantry door. Orville walked in carrying a bundle of dry towels. He placed them neatly on the metal shelf. His shoulders looked lighter than they had in many years. He smoothed the fabric with a steady palm. A heavy wooden box sat on the side table by the wall. Inside rested the old hand-stitched quilt from the back room. Orville had carried it here himself. He left it without saying a word. The fabric was worn at the corners. Tiny stitches held the blue squares together. My mother had patched similar blankets when I was young. Orville touched the hem with 2 fingers before stepping back toward the kitchen. I opened my new logbook on the stainless steel surface. The pages were blank white instead of yellowed cream. Every single column was ruled with pale blue ink. A delivery truck pulled up to the loading bay outside. The driver stepped down with 3 crates of root vegetables. I reached for my pencil and verified each item against the invoice. Orville stood by the prep table with a sharp knife. He sliced an onion with clean and even motions. The blade moved without catching on the board. He did not rush the work. "I am glad we kept the record straight," Orville said, keeping his eyes on the white cutting board. I nodded and wrote the delivery weight into the morning column. The morning orders required 30 pounds of beef and 10 bags of flour. I recorded every single digit without hesitation. The entries formed a straight line down the margin. Nobody stood behind my chair to check my work or question my totals. The restaurant operated on truth now. The hand-stitched quilt rested quietly on the wooden shelf near the doorway. Its faded patterns caught the morning light from the high window. Orville wiped his hands on a clean cloth and walked back to his station. I turned another blank page in the book. The pencil point met the paper with a soft scratch. The quiet inside the kitchen felt entirely different from the old days. There was no tension humming behind the stove hoods. Every receipt matched the physical inventory on the shelves. The errors of the past had been cleared away. Orville placed a small ceramic mug of coffee on the corner of my desk. I thanked him with a brief nod. He returned to his prep station without saying another word. The steam rose in a thin column from the dark coffee. I picked up my wooden-handled pen and completed the final entry for the morning produce delivery. The folded quilt remained on the shelf as a quiet reminder of what endured. I closed the new logbook with a clean snap. The kitchen was fully ready for the lunch service. The stainless steel counters reflected the overhead lights without distortion. Nothing was hidden inside the cabinets anymore. Every drawer held only what it was meant to hold. You know how it is when the dust finally settles. Nothing truly dramatic happens in the morning quiet. Orville wipes the stainless steel prep table without speaking. I tie my apron in the exact same double knot I have used for 12 years. We open the heavy back door to let the damp air inside. The morning delivery truck arrives on time with 20 pounds of flour. We carefully check every single bag against the physical invoice. You do not need to shout to make a point. You just need to keep your records straight. The culinary operations succeed because the everyday labor is genuine. That is all there ever was to it. I poured a fresh cup from the metal pot. I set it down near the deep sink. The dark liquid sat undisturbed in the ceramic mug, going slowly cold in the morning draft. Outside the frozen window, a city bus exhaled a heavy sigh at the corner stop. Orville turned on the radio softly in the back corner.